I used to teach children painting, and one of my children that I was teaching's father, he told Adrian that there was somebody that he'd like me to meet, and so he introduced us. And, me too, we sort of got on very well, and then he disappeared again for a while. I thought, oh well, that's that. And then suddenly one day he came in carrying a huge piece of soapstone that he thought I might like to use to carve. And, he used to do this, come and go, come and go. And then after a while he stayed longer and we were chatting. Talked and talked and talked. And he told me about all his adventures, and I always had an adventurous idea of having in my life. Then, I said, well, when are you going to take me into the Mokabeng? Because he'd been there once or twice, but he told me this was a marvellous place, it was very sacred and all that. And he said, oh no, he says he never takes any women with him anywhere. In fact, he doesn't like to take anybody with him anywhere. So I said, yeah, well, I'm different. I want to go with you. He came out when he was 16. He had always wanted to come to Africa. It was his dream. As soon as he got to South Africa, and they moved up to Joburg, he said he was at a party, I think, and he said to Enid, somebody's going up to the Northern, part of the way to the Northern Transvaal. I'm going along. I'm just going, and he just turned around, picked up his pack of his backpack with his knife, and I think he took a bag of salt with him and 2 shillings, and they thought he was going off for the evening. and they didn't hear from him for ages. He used to have these dreadful fits. Anybody else who has epilepsy falls down, has his fit, and that's it. But Adrian would fall down, have a fit, and then just when you think it's getting over it, he would get up and start crashing around and bashing things and ripping curtains off, and totally wild. I never knew what he was doing, and he'd be shouting. I don't know whether at this time he'd be seeing the spirits or whatever it was. He came home one day and said, he'd met this fabulous fellow. And he went to the university and he was introduced to Prof. Dart. And Dart was busy at that time with bone knives. And he had a whole showcase of various knives, from fossil knives through to some far Eskimo, I think, or, various knives around the world. And there was one bone knife from that was a fossil. Adrian said, he says, I've got one of those. He says, but this is a fossil. He says, well, I've got one that they're still using now. So Dart just did a dance. He was just so enthusiastic. He says, you're going right straight back. It was used for marula, for taking they're not allowed to use metal. Marula is a sacred fruit. And they were only allowed to use a bone knife to take the pip out.
Professor Dart offered Adrian Boshier a job, perhaps because he felt an affinity to this maverick, but he also realized that Adrian's connection with rural Africa was unique and gave him access to people and ideas inaccessible to other researchers.
Dart took him under his wing and he sent him up to we spent a lot of time in Mokopane. I should say almost a year on and off. We stayed in that little hut, excavating fossils. He was supposed to have these sort of powers, which were extraordinary. He really did have extraordinary powers. He always knew the right moment to come at the right time, to have some sort of a magical meaning for other people. He had always caught snakes, and he'd always come, when I say he had these powers, he always came into a kraal when they just had a problem with snakes, and he would catch the snake. I mean, it was absolutely amazing. They wouldn't see snakes for months, and then when they'd seen a snake or there was a trouble with snake, their Rarinoga would come in. We were walking looking for rock art, and in the distance I saw the clouds over the Baobab, and I said, you know, if you're so damn clever, why don't you make those clouds come over and give us some rain? And he said, okay, I will. And he walked ahead of me and he started walking, and then he'd say, Bula, Bula, you know, and he'd start calling it in, come on, Bula means open up. And he started sort of walking in this trance, and I walked behind. I thought, oh yeah. Anyway, the clouds, the breeze came up, and clouds started coming over. And just when we reached a sort of little, it was like an entrance to a little arena of rocks, the clouds came over and they opened up, and it rained. And we just stripped, and you know, it was so exciting when the rain came like that we danced. We just flung our arms out and we just did this rain dance. And then after a while we sheltered under a rock, and then the rain stopped, and the mist, you know, from the heat of the rocks, there was a mist, and then as it cleared, we saw, now this is extraordinary, we saw a painting on the rocks of two figures doing a rain dance. They were flinging out their arms.
The Makabeng Plateau was an ideal living space for the San and Khoisan people, providing food and shelter, as well as a good view of the surrounding veld. To date, over 900 rock art sites have been found all over the mountain, many of which were first traced and catalogued by Adrian Boshier and Joan van Gogh.
He was an intuitive person, and most people don't listen to their intuition, and I think he did. He intuitively knew where a rock painting was. I mean, it was unreal. He used to say, let's go and sniff them out today. And we would be walking along, he said, there's one over there. I said, you know, and we go up and we'd find it. And we actually discovered about 100 new sites.
Every region of southern Africa was occupied earlier by San people. And San people speaking a vast diversity of click languages. If you look at cultural sort of practices, you can certainly trace them back in southern Africa to at least 30,000 years ago.
The depiction of these shamans that Boshier found, he ended up saying this is the witch doctors of the Makabeng, referring to these shamans who was acquiring a ngum from this impala. Normally, it is believed in the science society that they can chase an impala. They can chase it the whole day until it becomes completely exhausted. Then it will be unable to stand properly. Then if a shaman wants to acquire a ngum or a supernatural potency, he will go and grab it by its ears like it happens there and just suck the ngum out of that animal before perhaps it dies. So during the medicine dance, when a shaman goes into trance, they see themselves being transformed into that kind of an animal. And immediately when they sing those medicine songs, the ngum becomes activated. And once it becomes activated, it started to boil and rising along the spine. Once the ngum hit the area of the stomach, it causes a lot of pains. You'll see figures of human beings bending forward like this. Some shamans actually fall over. So by just holding on the two dancing stick, it gives you support that you can continue dancing until that ngum passes the stomach and go along the spine and eventually hit the back of your brain. So what happened is that immediately when it hits the back of your brain, a person goes into full trance.
We'd been to the Baobab several times, and we suddenly saw this fellow sitting, looking at a dry little stream. And he was, in fact, we didn't even see his face. He was just sitting. And Adrian just knew it was Modisha. Don't know how. He never met him before. He went up to him. He didn't even see his face. He just said, "Hey, Modisha." And Adrian just spoke to him as if he'd known him all his life. He said, "Yes." He says, "I know what you're thinking." And he said, well, what am I thinking? And he said, "Well, you're thinking that they don't beat the drums anymore, and that's why there's no more rain." So he said, "It's just what I was thinking. It's just what I was thinking." And so he set up a ceremony that he had found in one of his previous trips. He'd found these sacred drums.
And nobody would tell him what it was about, and then slowly he got from them that they had hidden these drums at the time the missionaries actually came to Africa, to that area. So he got them to bring the drums out. He went all the way to Bamboo Ridge to get red ochre and bring it back to them because they needed the ochre for their ceremonies.
They beat the drums and it rained. So they knew of his powers, and he then met this witch doctor woman. Her name was Rasibi. She was an older lady, and she was very strong, Sangoma, very spiritual, and she wanted to start training him. And so he had an initiation. But Adrian didn't talk to me about it either. He wouldn't tell me. He was sworn to secrecy.
The problem is, to become a Sangoma, it has to be a genuine calling. You don't simply wish to become a Sangoma and become one. It's like you are in prison. Nothing that you want to do can be done. You will be told what to do. Once your ancestors' spirits have occupied you, if they are not satisfied where you are, they will have to guide you out of that place to where they want you to be. When nature has something to tell you, there are always people who will be able to understand what nature is saying to you. And they will tell you. It is up to you to find, as I told Adrian Bosch, of what was going to happen. Those people are always there. It's only that it's too difficult to believe, because you have a lot of other things to believe in.
We always knew when somebody was coming in the valley. When you're in a quiet place like that, I don't know if you found that, you just can sense a change in the feeling, in the atmosphere. Anyway, we knew that somebody was coming, and it was Modisha. And he came and he was very, very upset. He said, "There's a witch doctor who's putting a curse on us, and he's already, the lightning has already struck my cattle. 2 of my cows have died, and please can you come and lift this curse?" So we told him to come back later on in the afternoon, and we would come and we'd follow him. So we poured out some cordite from bullet that we had, and put some film, cut up a bit of film, and made things that were sort of flammable, and wrapped it all up in a bit of dusty skin, shoved it in a big snail shell, those big white snail shells. And then we walked over to, of course we had puffs, the puff adder. We had a puff adder that Adrian had caught in a bag. And so we carried Puffs along, and we went off to this village, and he came in the afternoon. We followed him all the way to his little kraal. They all went into their huts, and Adrian had a little bowl of water, which he sort of made a little, flapped his hands over, and it was now very strong water. And he went and splashed this over all the houses, the entrances of the houses. And then he took Puffs out, and he milked Puffs onto his tongue. I nearly fricked, I did. Anyway, and then he spat on all these places. You see, now this was very... By this time, the witch doctor's eyes were like this. He was cowering. He was watching from one of the darkened entrances of the doors. And it was dead silent. And then I took the shell to the middle, where their fireplace is, and I lit it. And at first nothing happened. Then this white plume came out. And then suddenly it sparked as it hit the cordite, and then big black oily plumes came out, and then I had to throw it over the wall, and then we walked out without saying a word, strode out, and that was it. And this guy, the next day, Modisha came, he said, "Curse is lifted, the witch doctor's gone, everything's fine now, it's wonderful."
I think in a way I was quite frightened of him. In between meals once, I looked into the fridge and he walked in and he caught me. And he really came down on me hard and called me a sissy and told me to get out the house and punished me for really just for being a child. And I never understood that. So I made it my quest to go and try and undo that, and find a way to almost call him up in my psyche and say, "Right, fella, we're going to have a talk about this." And the answer that I got for him was because he was embarrassed because the fridge was empty. For me, certainly, it made him more human. That he was fallible, he had these things. He just didn't choose to, he wanted to be something else.
He was crazy. He could be absolutely crazy and make you laugh. But he was, that's the nice side of him. He had a dark side. He was very egocentric, I thought, and very difficult to be married to, as a matter of fact. Really. We got on really well. It was great, but the children was a barrier to him. Didn't leave him his freedom and his space. I didn't give him enough space, actually. I mean, I loved the adventure, I loved doing with him, but I should never have lived my life for him. That was a big mistake. In fact, when we parted, I said to him, what was one of the worst things I ever did to make our marriage break up. And he said, "Well, you said you just always did everything for me." I said, "It's because I love you." He said, "Yeah, but you shouldn't have done it."